Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Candace DeCare. I'm an IP attorney from Kilpatrick, Townsend, and Stockton. I'm here today with the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta to talk about data privacy for nonprofits. If we go to the next slide, I got a little bit of information about the Pro Bono Partnership. It connects a network of attorneys with nonprofits who need legal advice. There are eligibility requirements to receive pro bono assistance. Your organization must be a 501c3 nonprofit. It must be located in or serve the greater Atlanta area. It must serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals, and your organization must be unable to afford legal services. We'll move on to the next slide. We do have a disclaimer. Any and all information contained in this presentation is not intended to constitute legal advice. You should consult with your own attorneys when developing your own policies and programs and to address your particular circumstances. Please do not take or refrain from taking action based on the contents of this presentation, and please don't assume that I'm addressing every applicable privacy or security measure. I am not. This is intended as an overview. It's intended to alert you to issues that you need to confront, and we're going to survey some appropriate best practices. Before we dig in, you have a chat window. You can type questions into the chat window, and we'll address them as we are able. We can go to slide 4. We're talking about data privacy for nonprofits. So you're a nonprofit organization, but like every organization, you need to manage privacy risks, such as unauthorized data destruction or modification, unauthorized data retention, and certainly unauthorized data disclosure. Now, this could be unauthorized disclosure by unauthorized parties, the hacker, the trespasser, but it also includes inadvertent destruction, modification, disclosure, or misuse by authorized parties. So you need to collect and use information, but you need to balance your need to collect and use that information with the increased risks that are associated with collection and use, and the increased costs and burdens in terms of human resources and time of keeping that information safe. You have to limit retention, disclosure, and use to what's authorized under the law, and you want to keep everything in line with general privacy principles. Even for nonprofit organizations, failure to manage privacy risks can have significant financial impact. It can lead to fines for violating regulations, and even more likely, it could lead to a loss of goodwill that can impact participation and contributions to your organization. So especially as we rely more and more on electronic collection, storage, and sharing of information, compliance with data privacy rules is absolutely critical. Not everything we touch on today will be universally applicable, but the urgent need to ensure privacy of personal data that you handle applies to every single one of us. We go to slide 5. It's titled Privacy of Personal Information. So when we talk about data privacy, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about privacy of personal information. And what is personal information? Personal information is information that can be used to identify an individual. I like the definition that's included in the Personal Data Notification and Protection Act that President Obama proposed in January 2015. He talks about unauthorized acquisition of sensitive, personally identifiable information. The Act defines sensitive, personally identifiable information. We'll take a look at that. But I do want to mention that that definition may change with time. The FTC has authority to amend the definition to take into account types of information or technologies that we might not yet be aware of. The focus is information or combinations of different kinds of information that can be used to identify a unique individual. So if we go to slide 6, sensitive, personally identifiable information means any information or any compilation of different kinds of information in electronic or digital form that includes first and last name or initial and last name, plus any two of the following: home address and telephone number, mother's maiden name, birthday, social security number, or any kind of government-issued identification number. It includes unique biometric data, such as a fingerprint or a retinal scan or a voice print. It includes unique account identifiers, as you might imagine, such as a username plus a password for an online account, or perhaps even a username plus a security question and answer that can be used to access an online account. and it includes combinations of data elements that can be used to access confidential information. For now, data breach, the privacy rules that require protection of personal information, this is governed by individual state law. The definition of sensitive personally identifiable information that we just went over, however, is a good working definition. It's exactly the type of information that's protected by most state laws, and it's exactly the type of information that your constituents, your donors, your volunteers, and your employees expect you to be able to protect. Another way to think about it, are you looking at the type of information or data that could be used for identity theft? If so, it is very likely personally identifiable information that you're required to protect under privacy laws and rules. So we go to slide 7. Here we are. It's necessary to collect, use, and store this information. You can't get around that. And it's likely, depending on your mission, to include sensitive, personally identifiable information. But doing this creates very real risks that you can't ignore. If we go to the next slide. Even though some of the privacy regulations explicitly exempt nonprofits, and recognizing that guarding data privacy can be a significant burden, you really do need to focus on taking reasonable, defensible measures to protect data privacy. And this may cause you to modify your operations. Knowledge of the potential risks and burdens of collecting and storing sensitive, personally identifiable information may lead you not only to implement controls to mitigate the risks, but it may also lead you to reduce the amount, to change the type of information that you collect and store. You may want to focus on what is absolutely necessary, and you'll definitely want to focus on notification and obtaining consents wherever feasible. We go to slide 9, that's titled Fair Information Practice Principles. So I've hit pretty hard on the need to ensure privacy of data you handle, and I'll continue to do that. But let's talk about developing controls to handle some of the risks. Good place to start is these Fair Information Practice Principles. You'll hear them discussed as FIPS. They were set out in a 1998 FTC report. These privacy elements are an excellent frame of reference for U.S. entities that collect, store, and use personally identifiable information. I say U.S. entities because if you have any dealings with entities in another country, if you transfer data across borders, there's a whole other set of rules that apply to you, and you should most certainly talk to an attorney about that. So the first FIP, notice and awareness. Common sense. Make sure that the people from whom you collect information know that you're collecting information, and make sure that they know why you're collecting it and how you're going to use it. You can do this pretty easily. You can publish, you can make available a good privacy policy. An integral part of this is the next FIP, choice and consent. Get permission to collect the information. Make sure that your constituents, your volunteers, your donors understand, and make sure that they acquiesce, make sure they opt in. You also need to provide them with control, some way to revoke their consent, to get their information back, to ensure that it's not kept in your records. You need to give them a way to opt out. The next FIP, access, participation, again, common sense. The people from whom you collect personally identifiable data need to be provided some way to access that data, perhaps to update it, perhaps to revoke their consent and take it back, but they need to be able to review the information. Closely related, the next FIP, integrity, security. You need to make sure that the information is accurate, and you need to make sure that it's kept safe and secure and used only for authorized purposes. And the last FIP is enforcement. Common sense, again, you need to ensure that you're complying with the applicable rules. I would say in addition to the 5 FIPs, you should consider what you'll hear talked about, data minimization. You need to reduce collection and use of personal information to what is truly necessary, to what's in line with your mission. So we go to the next slide. What are the rules? So it's easy to say enforcement, comply with the rules, but what are they? Unfortunately, in the United States, there is no simple answer. There's no omnibus law in the United States that prescribes data privacy measures. Right now we have a patchwork quilt, perhaps more appropriately a crazy quilt of different laws that apply to different specific types of information. For example, healthcare information is governed by very specific rules set out in HIPAA and amendments to HIPAA, such as HITECH and GINA. Financial information is regulated by the Fair Credit Reporting Act and a slew of other laws and regulations. Education information is regulated by FERPA, and I could go on. In addition, we've already got a lot of different kinds of federal rules that are applicable to specific kinds of information. Each state also has its own unique state rules about unfair and deceptive trade practices, about identity theft, and about data breach. And then in addition to that, there's industry self-regulation. Different industries have different standards and rules. An example that may apply to you is the payment card industry. There are specific rules applicable to processing credit card data. So if we go to the next slide, clearly very important to determine what the rules are and how you need to comply. Again, even if the laws exempt nonprofits, it's in your best interests to protect data privacy consistent with the requirements of the law. So your first step, you need to define the issue. What's your problem? What's the data that you collect? Is it personally identifiable information? And note, even though the definition of personally identifiable information that we discussed before focuses on electronic and digital data, even though that's where the problem typically lies, you also need to protect privacy of information that you may collect and store by paper means, store in regular old filing cabinets. So it's prudent to seek advice, legal advice, in determining what rules apply to your organization. And once you've figured that out, once you know what your obligations are, you need to build policies and practices for your collection, storage, and use of information. If you collect a lot of personally identifiable information, if you acquire it from other sources, if you put it to significant use or share it with other entities, or even if it's particularly sensitive information that may directly impact the safety of your constituents or your volunteers, you may want to consider not only legal advice, but also seeking help from a privacy or security professional. These are people who are familiar with all of the legal requirements. They have the technological expertise. They can look at your systems, help to identify potential problems, and help to design a workflow and security measures that are suited to your particular organization. So once you have your policies and practices in place, the next step is training. You need to make sure that your employees and volunteers are trained and fully aware. You also need to be transparent. You need to notify the people from whom you collect information. Easiest way is through a privacy policy. Finally, don't rest on all that work. You have to stay current. Stay vigilant. If you start collecting a different type of information, if the technology changes, maybe your software needs an update or a patch, or as information becomes obsolete and you need to get rid of it, you need to stay updated and to stay on top of it. We go to the next slide, documenting a privacy policy. This is a great place to start. Putting together a privacy policy will force you to think about the issues that you need to address. It'll force you to identify the type of information you collect, the uses to which you put it now or reasonably foreseeably will put it in the future, the form in which you collect or store or use it, and the specific means by which you protect it. As we go to the next slide, core components of a privacy policy. There's nothing revolutionary here. These core components are in line with the FIPS, the Fair Information Practice Principles. Notice, you need to tell people that you're collecting their information. You need to tell people what you're doing with it. Choice and consent. Give people a choice whether their information is collected, and get meaningful consent for the specific uses to which it is put. Typically, this means an opt-in provision. There's a lot of discussion of what constitutes meaningful consent. We're all familiar with click-through agreements where we scan down a whole bunch of legal boilerplate and click a window at the end. I would encourage you to develop a privacy policy that's clear, understandable, and to do everything you can to require that it really will be reviewed so that opting in is meaningful consent. Minimization, we talked about minimization. Part of your privacy policy should be limiting the kinds of information you keep. Make sure that it's necessary to your mission. And of course, accuracy. Make sure that what you collect and use is accurate and up to date. Go to the next slide. These are just more core components. Data retention, this is consistent with data minimization. Don't keep it longer than you have to. And when you dispose of it, make sure it's safely disposed of. Make sure it's truly deleted, erased, shredded, whatever needs to happen to ensure that the personally identifiable information is gone and can't be recovered or used without authorization. Security, well, back to common sense, something's not private unless you have physical or technological measures to limit access to people who are authorized to see it. You do need to take a look if you work with vendors or third-party service providers. Make sure that they have appropriate data protection measures in place. And you'll need to look at that contract. Make sure that it's very clear who is assuming responsibility for what. Basically, who's on the hook when something goes wrong. Your privacy policy also needs to provide users, those people who are going to be allowing their information to be collected, they need to know that the policy may change, and you need to tell them how they'll be notified when it does. Likewise, your privacy policy should provide contact information so that if people have questions or concerns, they know where to direct them. The next slide, don't stop at drafting and implementing the policy. Training is very important. You need to ensure that anyone who may collect, have access to, or use personally identifiable information that your organization is gathering, you need to make sure they're aware of the policy and that they follow it. At the very least, you need to ensure that your people know how to respond to questions about data privacy. Now that may be just designating a point person, refer questions to so-and-so, but they need to have some response when they're asked that question. Your people need to know under what circumstances they need to obtain consent to collect, use, or share personally identifiable information, and they need to know what personally identifiable information is, right? So they recognize and address requests appropriately. And finally, they need to know how to handle complaints about data privacy. And here again, that may just be that you've designated a point person to whom they refer such complaints, but this all needs to be documented out there and kept up to date. The next slide, access to personal information. Practical points, clearly, you're going to be better off if you limit access to those with a need to know. You definitely want password-restricted access to computer system with user IDs and passwords that are unique to each user. So no stickies on the bottom of the keyboard with the password written down, nothing in the desk drawer, and good passwords. I was at a presentation yesterday where I learned that the most common password still is 1234566. The second most common password is password. Stay away from those. It's not meaningful protection if it's that easy to guess. And if your records are paper, lock the filing cabinets and limit who has keys. And whether it's keys or user passwords, consider tracking access to sensitive, personally identifiable information. It's a best practice, and it also provides you with essential information in the worst of circumstances if there's a data breach. So make sure you know who has access rights and keep that list updated and current. And consider even logging access so that you know not only who has who can access the information, but also who has access to the information. The next slide, I wanted at least to mention social media. It's omnipresent. If you use social media, for that matter, even if you don't, because I'm sure that some of your volunteers or employees are bound to, you should consider a social media policy. That can be a standalone policy, or it can be wrapped into your privacy policy. It'll set out terms and conditions governing social media use in connection with your organization. The policy should address content. After all, you want to ensure that content that's out there on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook is consistent with your mission. Consider providing for a specific person at your organization who's in a position to approve social media posts and who's also in a position to ensure that you have consent, for example, for any photos that you might wish to post. You can find model social media policies online. For that matter, you can find model privacy policies online. Those are helpful as an educational matter, But I would strongly advise that for your particular organization, you seek attorney assistance. You need to ensure that your policy is appropriate and that it's tailored to your particular needs. On the next slide, there's a typo here. I apologize for the other can spam, which was a note to myself. I'm going to gloss over this and slide 19 for the sake of time. Each of these slides mentions particular privacy-related law that I deemed more likely to apply to nonprofits. This law can spam. It governs unsolicited commercial emails. It can apply to nonprofits. It specifically provides that it can apply to nonprofits in certain circumstances. CAN spam requires that individuals have a right to opt out of unwanted communications. I recommend that you seek legal advice about CAN spam if you send solicitation emails, if you send emails promoting any kinds of goods or services, or if you use mailing lists that you may have acquired from other entities, other sources. On the next slide, we mentioned this already. You should be aware that there's an industry standard applicable to credit card processing. Practically speaking, most of you probably use PayPal to facilitate donations and other transactions. Educate yourself about PayPal's policies. The link is provided here, but do know that PayPal does comply with the standard. The next slide, I did want to remind you, we talked about this patchwork of laws in the United States. There are additional specific privacy and data security requirements imposed by other laws, typically specific to certain subject matter. Again, I'd recommend that you seek legal advice to determine whether any of what you do falls within those categories and to determine what additional requirements you may be subject to. So now let's turn from the privacy requirements to the big risk, the big exposure, and that's this next slide, data breach. What do you do if in spite of all your efforts, there's a data breach? A data breach could be a hack, it could be a virus and insufficient firewall. It could be something as mundane as, oh my gosh, I lost my phone or I left my laptop on the bus. Could be intentional or unintentional, but either way, you're stuck with it. So what are your obligations if you know or reasonably believe that personally identifiable information that you collected is somehow out in the world? We've got laws now in just about all of the states. I think Alabama, New Mexico, and South Dakota are the only states that don't have data breach laws. But these laws in each state define data breach, and they require specific actions in response to a data breach. Data breach laws typically specify who has to comply with them, what kind of information triggers the requirements, what constitutes a breach that would trigger the requirements, and what kind of notice is required and to whom. They all require notification to people whose information has been breached, but some of them also require, depending on the circumstances, notification to specific law enforcement entities or even to credit agencies. Most of these laws do provide exemptions. If you take appropriate security measures, for example, encrypting data, the notification requirements may not apply. To use an example, I left my laptop on the bus, but we've got measures in place where I can remote wipe the laptop and all of the data on it's encrypted anyway. That loss may not trigger data breach notification requirements. I thought we'd take a quick look, the next slide, at Georgia's data breach law. The law is pretty typical. If your organization suffers a data breach, you have to notify affected Georgia residents as soon as possible by mail, by telephone, or by electronic means. If it's a big breach, it's so large that it affects more than 100,000 people, or it's going to be so expensive to fulfill the notification requirement that's going to exceed $50,000, you are permitted to substitute notification. I'm not sure substitute notification is a whole lot less expensive. It requires all of three things: email notice, if you have email addresses, conspicuous posting of information about the breach on your website, if you maintain a website, and notification to major statewide media. Georgia law also requires that a breach of that magnitude must be reported to all credit reporting agencies. It's worth noting that under the Georgia law, an organization that maintains its own notification procedures as part of a formal information security policy, that organization will be deemed to have complied with the Georgia law. so long as the timing requirements of its internal policy are consistent with Georgia law. So that's a plug for having a formal information security policy. It may relieve you, or at least allow you to tailor the legal requirements to something that's more manageable for you. We go to the next slide. Georgia's definition of personal information. Okay, yeah, this is slide 23. My apologies. Georgia's definition of personal information, breach of which would trigger these notification requirements, it's largely consistent with what we looked at earlier under the federal definition. In Georgia, the focus is explicitly on information that would be sufficient to perform or to attempt to perform identity theft against the person whose information was compromised. We go to the next slide. The basic requirements of Georgia's law. It applies to information brokers or data collectors that keep computerized data, including personal information. Such entities must give notice of a data breach to a person whose unencrypted data was or is reasonably believed to have been subject to unauthorized acquisition. So you don't have to know it happened, you just have to believe it's reasonably likely that the information is out there. So who's an information broker or data collector that's subject to the Georgia state law? Well, data collectors are defined in terms of governmental entities with certain exemptions for government agencies that keep track of traffic enforcement or real estate transactions, law enforcement, etc. Information broker generally means an entity that collects money for collecting, assembling, compiling, storing personally identifiable information for the primary purpose of furnishing that information to non-affiliated third parties. Is your organization an information broker under Georgia law? Maybe not. That's a subject that you should talk about with your attorney. But whether your organization falls within that technical definition or not, here again, it's a very good idea to comply with the data breach notification requirements of the Georgia law. How fast does Georgia require notification? In the most expedient time possible and without unreasonable delay. So as fast as you can, immediately. Georgia also requires immediate remedial steps to address the breach. Of course, you want to stop the flow of information as soon as you can. The text of the law also requires expedience and no unreasonable delay. The next slide, I just wanted at least to point out that the data breach notification requirement also applies to service providers, someone who may be maintaining personal data for another organization. Those service providers have a 24-hour rule. If they determine there's been a data breach or that there is reasonably likely to have been a data breach, they have 24 hours to notify you of that breach. And then, of course, you need to proceed with your own notification obligations. As we go to the next slide, let's look at how to minimize chances of a data breach. Again, these measures, there's nothing revolutionary here. These are really consistent with what we talked about in the FIPS and what we talked about as the building blocks of a good privacy policy. Don't keep more data than you have to, and don't scatter it all over the place. You want to limit the places where such data might be accessed, and you want to make it easier for yourself to keep track of the data. You want to limit access with password protection or through encryption. You need to stay on top of your records, delete outdated or irrelevant information, and ensure that it really is deleted. Regularly update your software and security. You may need to think about a bring your own device policy. Do you allow volunteers or employees or others to use or store data that you've collected on their own personal devices, their own laptops, their own phones, their iPad, whatever they have? If so, you need to have measures in place to exercise some control over dissemination of that information to ensure that it too is safe. If you are going to allow people to store, use such information on their own devices, it's advisable to seek advice from a privacy or security professional who's on top of the technology and can help you implement appropriate protective measures. We go to the next slide. I can't overstress the importance of making a data breach plan. You will be so very grateful that you have a written, detailed plan when you get that dreaded call letting you know that your security has been compromised and that personally identifiable data that you've collected may be out there. What should a plan include? It's very practical. Start by designating a point person to secure the breach, to stop the flow of information, and to do a postmortem to determine causes and ways to prevent a reoccurrence. That may be one person, that may be several people, but designate them. Write down their names, make sure you know who they are, make sure it's updated, and make sure you've included their 24-hour emergency contact information so that when you get the call that there's a breach, and you know, popular commentary says this is a matter of when, not if. In fact, popular commentary, most of the industry says that just about all organizations have suffered one or more data breaches. We just may not all know about it. So you've got to be prepared. So you've designated your point person to stop the flow of information and to prevent this from happening again. Next, make a list of your legal requirements. Very practical list. Who do you need to notify? How fast do you need to do it? If feasible, include their numbers. You may not be able to include information for all of the people from whom you've collected information, but provide some indication of where that information can be collected or determined. If you have to inform a law enforcement agency, set that down right there with the contact information. Likewise with credit reporting agencies. Determine how you're going to fulfill the notification requirement. Is it going to be email and a phone call? Do you have enough of a problem that you can go to this public service announcement? And designate a point person to coordinate the logistics of the notification. Consider setting up to be able very quickly to put up a website notice informing your constituents of the breach, possibly even setting up a phone line so that you can address questions and concerns about the breach. Make sure that you know the relevant contractual provisions with your vendors or service providers if you have any, and include in your plan any notification requirements that you may owe to them. You know, who do you need to call if there's been a data breach? It's important also to make sure that you know your insurance coverage. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I hope you have some. And that insurance coverage also typically contains notification requirements, so you need to include those in your data breach response plan. We go to the next slide, risk mitigation. Information governance is what we're really talking about. It's prudent information governance, basic principles. Know your information, obtain permissions, keep your customers informed. You can consider managing privacy risks with visibility. That's a nice way to think about it. You limit access to information to those who need to see it. Stay on top of your security measures and have a data breach plan. The next slide, cyber liability insurance. I wanted at least to mention cyber liability insurance. It's a very hot topic. It's definitely something you'll want to seek informed advice about because it's very particular to your organization. It is a prudent acquisition. Your general liability policy is highly unlikely to cover compromised data or what can be the tremendous costs of responding to and remediating a data breach. Cyber liability insurance is available, but you need to ensure that it covers all of the possible risks from the evildoer, the intentional hacker, to the technological anomaly, where did the data go, the ghost in the machine, to the ordinary mistake, with my laptop on the bus, or what we call the blogger, and that's the volunteer or employee who artlessly and unintentionally publishes personally identifiable information that should be protected. Go to the next slide. You should definitely have an attorney review any cyber liability policy. Some of the special issues that you need to make sure you check: territory limits, deductibles, overall policy limits, and we've seen in a lot of cyber liability policies what I would characterize as relatively tricky sublimits. There will be an overall policy limit, but then there's a sublimit for specific types of events that can be called a data breach or remediation of a data breach or compliance with a notification requirement. Ideally, you'd want to be covered for fines and penalties, perhaps even court costs that may attend a data breach. And of course, check the exclusions. Make sure that you're covered for inadvertent errors in addition to the intentional bad actor kind of hacking. And if you use vendors or service providers, you may want to check and see if you can be listed as an additional insured on their policies. If we go to the next slide, it's a lot of information. I'll close just by reiterating you cannot ignore data privacy. I encourage you to seek advice in this area. You need to know your responsibilities and risks. You need to formulate policies and practices to protect personal information, and you need to ensure that all of the policies, all of the information is communicated to your constituents, your volunteers, your donors, and your employees. You need to stay current, and that is a mammoth task sometimes, to ensure that your training and your security measures are up to date. And I think that's it. I surmise we have some questions. I thank you very much for your time and attention, and we'll turn to questions. Well, we have a couple of questions, and I'm going to ask you to please repeat the question All right. So the first question is, we asked our volunteers to collect name, address, and email address information when people contact us to obtain more information about our organization. Do you have any concerns about volunteers having this information? Concerns about volunteers keeping this information. Name, address, and email is arguably personally identifiable information that would be covered by the law. I don't have concerns about volunteers having this information. I think for any nonprofit organization, that's inevitable. But I do think the volunteers need to be advised of the privacy policy, and they need to be able to assure people, to tell people, here's why we need the information. Do I have your permission to keep and store this information? And here are the purposes for which we're using it. If this is and I know how it works. This is often something that happens on the phone or in person. It's not always online. Online, it's easy because an attorney can help you generate an online form that contains all of the requisite consents and languages. I would recommend, if you have volunteers on the phone or in person, have a training session. They need to know what they need to be saying, what kind of information they need to convey, and what kind of consent they need to get to protect you. And a lot of this in the real world, right, this may be overkill. The problem is when, what we're trying to protect you from is when the issue arises, and we all know that it does. Mistakes happen, problems arise, and you want to ensure that you're in the best possible position. Next question is, can you give an example of who constitutes a privacy or security professional? All right, the question was, can I give an example of who constitutes a privacy or security professional? I don't have a specific example, and probably shouldn't give one even if I did. But if you search online, look for service providers who offer what's called a privacy impact assessment. You'll see PIA, or privacy impact assessment, all in capital letters. That is probably what is most applicable. I have found service providers, and for nonprofit organizations, I think if you can find someone who combines a privacy impact assessment with a security impact assessment, they're very closely related. That's someone who can come in and will just sit down with you and hash through it. What's the information you collect? Where is it? What kind of system do you use? What kind of passwords do you use? How many people have access? Very, very practical assistance. I am aware of some such professionals who do provide pro bono services to certain organizations. Beyond that, I don't have more specifics for you, but if you search for the privacy impact assessment, you will turn up a multitude of professionals who are offering this service. This is it's a very hot area. It's a changing field, and with the advent of networked devices and the Internet of Things and the prevalence of electronic storage, this is in the forefront of people's minds. So there is a lot of this out there. Okay. The question is, how do you determine how long you can or should keep information? And I don't have a simple answer because it's inextricably interwoven with the purpose for which you're keeping the information. When you collected the personally identifiable information, what did you tell the person from whom you're collecting it? If it's It really does. It depends upon the purpose for which you're using it. As a rule of thumb, I think part of your internal privacy policy should be to review personally identifiable information that you're keeping. I'd recommend annually, but certainly every 2 years. Um, and again, it depends upon the terms under which you initially collected it. But you know, I have one client who does an annual audit. And it's people who have given permission to be contacted by email, and it's a simple email. You know, do you wish to remain included on our donor list or our volunteer list? And then you get the response. You're giving them a chance to consent again to exceed or not to exceed. And if they don't agree, then you do need to delete the data. And like I said, you need to ensure that it's really and truly deleted and not just hidden on your systems. There are tons of software out there for various applications for nonprofits. Do you have any suggestions for any software that's good software? The question is, there are tons of software and apps for nonprofits. Do I have any recommendations? And I must confess that although I am on top of the law governing data privacy and security, Internet of Things and such, I am definitely not a techie. So I apologize, but I do not have a particular recommendation for a software package. Here again, that's where an IT person who is a privacy professional, someone who offers these privacy impact assessments, would probably be your best source of referrals. I'll note also there are organizations, and I apologize, I will provide you with the name of them, but there are organizations that are looking very closely at this area for nonprofits, and there are a wealth of very good, reliable online resources that may be of specific assistance in that regard. So I'll ensure that the Pro Bono Partnership has that information. All right, that was our last question. I would like to thank you all for your time and attention, and I would especially like to thank the Pro Bono Partnership for the opportunity to address you. And with that,